Hello, students. This is Professor Gore, and in this lecture, I'm going to be covering the kind of expansion of the American West. And so you can kind of ignore this chapter number. It corresponds to a different textbook than the one that your current edition that you're using. But let's talk about the actual American West. So I'm going to break this lecture up into three parts. The first part, we're going to talk about the railroads, really in the cattle industry and the hunting of the bison and so forth. And then later we'll talk about farming and mining and of course the most famous part is the conflict with Native Americans and so forth that takes place. So nowhere else in the world do you have the geography shaping a place's history, at least in the United States, I should say, not anywhere in the world, but in the United States, because the Great Plains states are what we call semi-arid. That means they get between 10 to 20 inches of rainfall a year. So if it was below 10, it would be arid, desert. If it was above 20, it wouldn't be semi-arid. So um, really what you'll see is they have taken the average rainfall in a given year over the last 100 and so years in the Great Plains states. And they have calculated the average, and not a single year has met the average. And so what that means is that rain is sporadic. Some years it can be really wet. Some years it's really dry. And that is the great difficulty living, farming, ranching, and so forth, hunting on the Great Plains. And what you'll see takes place is because of the geography of the area and so forth. So the two resources that it lacks is one is water. The other one is trees, timber. Okay, so that's going to make a challenge for building housing and so forth on the Great Plains. And so you'll see that a lot of American farmers will build their houses out of sod and dirt and grass and so forth. So the 98th meridian on a map would kind of divide the line of semi-aridity. Okay, and so some critics, for instance, some of the earliest settlers, these were Americans that went out west, call it the Great American Desert because it did not have the amount of water and rivers and so forth that the eastern states had. Plus, when you get all the way out to Oregon that gets tons of rain, of course you're going to think it's a Great American Desert in comparison to that. So this is the region that we're talking about. And you can see the different topography and mountains and grasslands and so forth. Also, now this is not all the tribes in North America. This is just kind of some of the major ones. But you can see that a lot of these tribes live on the Great Plains in the mid-1800s. Now, most of these tribes actually did not live on the majority of the Great Plains before the Europeans arrived. For instance, a lot of them live in some of the mountain states or further east. For instance, the Sioux actually lived in present-day Minnesota, but because tribes were pushed further west from European encroachment, they were kind of kicked out in the Great Plains. But Native Americans did not have domesticated horse before the Spanish arrived. The Spanish introduced it when they arrived in the region in the 1500s. And so by the 1700s, at least late 1700s, most tribes, really all the tribes in the Great Plains, had domesticated horse. And so that allowed them to travel further distances and hunt the great bison herds and also hunt elk on the Great Plains and so forth. None of that would have been possible without that Columbian exchange interaction of domesticated horse. The times they did hunt bison and so forth, it was done where they would try to run them off of cliffs, different other methods, but it wasn't until they had acquired domesticated horses that they could actually hunt. So the famous scene in Dances with Wolves, where Kevin Costner and the Sioux tribe are hunting bison on the Great Plains, is a great scene and so forth. None of that would have been possible without the domesticated horse. So about 100,000 estimated, it's really difficult to calculate this, but about 100,000 in the mid-1800s lived on the plains for Native Americans. Now we're going to cover Native Americans and the conflict with the U.S. And so forth in the third part of this lecture topic, but just want to introduce that you have that. Now the Mandans, Arikaras, and Pawnees created permanent villages. The rest of them that lived on there were mobile and so forth, and they were nomadic. The Kiowas and the Comanche kind of dominated the southern plains. Um, you had the Blackfeet and the Crows kind of were in the northwest part of the Great Plains. The Sioux were in the northern part. The Arapahoes and Cheyenne were kind of in the central part of the plains. And there's other tribes, but these were kind of the big dominant ones. Now, one of the things that you'll see as well is there had been in the 1840s, the decade, that particular decade was an increased amount of rain that took place. And so bison herds were able to reproduce at higher rates than they had previously. And then one of the things that you'll see as well is there was a greater demand for bison hides with the fur trade. And so the fur trade was still going on in the 1800s, and particularly the bison hides were going to be used for leather for belts on machinery in the Industrial Revolution. So you have this demand for leather belts to help operate this machinery. And so that is going to increase this demand to hunt bison. So as bison herds are hunted to close to extinction, they don't become extinct. Native Americans are going to fight even more so when they're really at a time when they need to unite against the U.S. encroachment. And so that's going to lead to further conflict. This is a picture of a Native American village. They would typically settle along creeks. Now, this is kind of interesting that one of the reasons why you don't see as much conflict in the 1840s and 1850s between Native American tribes in the Great Plains and American settlers going out west, either settle in Oregon or Northern California, or particularly for the gold rush. Well, in the winter times, Native American tribes settled along creek beds, okay? And the limited timber that is available on the Great Plains is primarily along the creek beds. Also along the creek beds, you kind of get some shelter naturally from the topography to shield yourself from the harsh winter winds. You can also cut down trees for fire. Now, a lot of times they use buffalo dung, so buffalo poop, basically to heat their teepees in the winter. And so then in the spring and summer and early fall, the Native American tribes would leave the creek beds and then go out on the main Great Plains to hunt bison herds. What was interesting was that in the spring and summertime, American settlers would be going out west and they'd be following the rivers and the creek beds. So they would be going in the areas in the spring and summer where the Native Americans would be in the wintertime. And so that's why they didn't cross paths as much as they would have if they would have migrated a different season. The problem is a lot of those American settlers, to have fuel for their fires at night to cook their food, would cut down the trees. And so it's going to lead to really a fuel shortage for the wintertime for Native Americans as you're going to progress in the preceding decades. So really where the settlers going before the Civil War, they're going further west. They were going to California and Oregon for farming and also the gold rush. And then they were going to Utah with the Mormons. And the Mormons are going to spread out into other areas as well, like Idaho, Arizona, New Mexico, and so forth. But primarily they settled in Utah. So what did the government need to connect the East and the West? Well, they need a transcontinental railroad that can ship goods from the West Coast. They're trading with Asia, particularly in China and India and the Philippines and other places, and then ship them east, and then ship manufactured goods across the transcontinental railroad to the West Coast, and then sell those across the Pacific Ocean to places like China and elsewhere, Japan and other countries. So the transcontinental railroad is one of the most important transportation and infrastructure things ever built in American history. So the early form of mail service to the West was the Pony Express, and eventually the railroad is going to kind of one-up it and put the Pony Express out of business. Now, this right here is a picture taken from a plane in the 1950s. Now, ignore the big kind of like snake-looking thing. That's an irrigation area. But you look at, and in the 1950s, you can still see the ruts of wagons that had crossed the Great Plains in the mid-1800s. That's incredible that a century later, those ruts are still there in the landscape, because that's how many people traveled across the Great Plains in various weather conditions, particularly when it rained. That's what it would lead to ruts. Plus, those Conestoga wagons are very heavy. So let's look at the Transcontinental Railroad. The cost to build was far too expensive for railroad companies to have enough cash or collateral to basically build it. So what the government did is it wanted to give them money to actually build it, but the government didn't have enough cash reserves to give them a loan to build it or whatever. So what the government did have is it technically owned land in the West. Now, of course, that was Native American land, but in the U.S. eyes, they had acquired it through the Louisiana Purchase and the Mexican-American War, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So the government gave the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific land grants. Now, the Union Pacific builds west from Omaha, Nebraska, towards the Rocky Mountains, and they're eventually going to build all the way to Utah. The Central Pacific started in Sacramento because there was already a railroad built from San Francisco to Sacramento, and they were heading east. And so they really had the toughest job because they had to cut and dynamite their way through the Sierra Nevadas, which is full of thick granite. Granite's one of the most dense rocks on the planet. So they didn't lay as much track because they were going through much more difficult. It took them forever just to dynamite through one mountain. So they eventually met with the Union Pacific in Promontory Point, Utah. So what the federal government did is it would give them land grants on north and south of each side of the track. Now, they wouldn't give every land plot. It's kind of like a checkerboard. They would give every other plot of land to the railroad. So as the railroad was building west, they would in turn sell the land grant to settlers, okay? And people wanted to be as near to the railroad as they possibly could because it was cheaper to ship their crops or their livestock or whatever it is they were in the business of. And so that's how the railroad companies could afford to buy the steel tracks or iron tracks to hire the workers, make the cut in the landscape to put a track and so forth. And so it was all about the selling of land. And so that's how the Transcontinental Railroad was funded. And so you can see on the blue here on the right, that was where the Union Pacific built from Omaha. And the red was where the Central Pacific built from Sacramento. And so that's where they met, was in Promontory Point, Utah, just north of the Great Salt Lake. And so it's pretty incredible. Now, what the Union Pacific does, they use a variety of workers, but the largest two groups that they used were Irish and African Americans. Now, they used a lot of Civil War veterans on both the Union and Confederate side, but Irish and African Americans made up the two largest groups. Irish being the largest, African Americans probably being the second largest. The Central Pacific primarily used Chinese workers. Now, there was Mormon workers that were used that were hired out, but the Chinese provided the majority of the workers. And so what you see happening, one of the reasons why so many Chinese came over to the California coast is they were trying to escape the Taiping Rebellion that had taken place in the 1850s. Okay, it was the most violent rebellion in world history. And that's saying something because there's been some terrible rebellions in world history. It was the greatest loss of life in a war in America, or really in world history, until World War I and World War II happened. So they were trying to escape that, plus the promise of the gold rush. And so you have this push and pull factors leading to Chinese workers migrating to the West Coast. So even though a lot of them came for the gold rush, very few people became wealthy. Chinese, Americans, Latinos, whoever they came, very few became wealthy from gold. It was mainly the people who mined, the miners, the store owners. And so they began finding work in the railroads. And then also the Central Pacific sent merchants to recruit workers from the Chinese coast as well. And they came over in large numbers. And that's where you have some of the earliest Asian Americans coming over in U.S. history. It's pretty cool. Now, this is one of the most famous images of the 1800s American history. And these are Union and Central Pacific workers meeting at Promontory Point, Utah, and the owners of the railroads meeting. And they hammered in a gold spike. Of course, they took it out and put in a metal one. But what's interesting is that in this picture, you don't see any of the Chinese workers. They were kept out of the image. So that shows you the prejudice of the day. And here's a picture from the side. And so from that point, when it was finished in 1869, it sets off a railroad building boom in the West. And so what ends up happening is they built 4 transcontinental railroads across the U.S. They built the main one in the center part. They built one from Kansas City down to L.A. through the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad. And they also built one on the Southern Pacific Railroad that went from basically kind of part of New Orleans in through the heart of Mississippi across Texas, all the way across the southern part of Arizona, New Mexico, into LA. Now, the most famous one was the one in the center, but the northern one was probably the best built one. It's built by James J. Hill. And James J. Hill had, actually, there's two that you can see up there, but the one that doesn't have land on each side, he did not get a land grant from the federal government. What he did is he would invest into towns and create economic commerce and would create property and so forth that way, and kind of built it a little bit slower, but built it a little more financially conservatively, and built it very well, and helped kind of boost some of the economy in northern Montana and North Dakota into Washington and Idaho. You can see right here on the bottom left the checkered thing. So every other square mile was given to the railroad company, where the government owned the other part. And so basically allowed the railroad companies to finance this expensive transportation innovation. So the railroads help create time zones. There's 4 time zones in the United States, and the 48 states. Hawaii and Alaska are a different time zone. Here's James J. Hill, the Great Northern Railroad. Later, his monopoly with Northern Securities gets busted up by Teddy Roosevelt in the early 1900s, that he kind of joined a trust with J.P. Morgan. And you can see the other railroads that are built. It's incredible how many railroads are built between 1870 and 1890 in the West. And the United States can have more miles of track than all of Europe combined. That's saying something, because Russia builds the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Now, this is an adult male bison at the end of its life, but these are massive animals. And they're actually leaner than shorthorn cattle. And in fact, bison meat at grocery stores is more expensive. It's a higher rate per pound. And it's actually leaner and healthier for you. I actually like bison, especially if it's seasoned well. This is another little bit normal size bison. Now, we oftentimes call them buffalo and so forth. That's really referring to water buffalo. And so the North American bison is the proper name. And so this image right here, painted by George Catlin, of a bison getting hunted and shot by a Native American, really only happened for about 150 years because of the domesticated horse brought to the region in the 1700s. And here's some other ones. You see this one knocked off his horse, because sometimes bison would attack horses, and you'd have people killed on hunts. This is what a stretched out bison hide would look like. It's drying out. Here are some white fur trappers and so forth. And they were kind of, I don't know if you call them taxidermists or whatever. Here is a painting to show you the devastating effects of the hunting of the bison. And so you have 2 groups that are hunting bison in large numbers. You have Native Americans for a food source, and also to sell hides for profit to traders. But the most amount of bison that were hunted by Americans. And the Americans hunted them because of the price that they fetched for their hides, and also bison tongue. Now, it's weird to imagine, but bison tongue was considered a delicacy food-wise at that time. It was kind of like filet mignon. And these bison hides were used to create leather belts on machines in industrial factories in the East. And it was devastating to what happens to the bison populations. But more importantly, it's devastating to what happens in Native American way of life, because they had been used to hunting like that for 150 years or so. And so they were unable to provide for themselves. And that's going to be one of the causes of Native American resistance ending, that we'll cover in part 3 of this topic. Look at the amount of bison hides that are stacked up there. Look at the amount of skulls and bones. This one right here, to me, symbolizes the mass almost extinction of bison in the 1870s. So it really takes place over the course of about 7 to 10 years, primarily in the 1870s, where the railroad companies viewed them as a nuisance, because the herds would oftentimes get in the way of the track, and you couldn't really move them out of the way. So they would hire hunters to go kill them. Now, I'll show you a picture in just a minute. Native Americans used every part of the bison, where the American hunters would just use them for their hides and their tongues. And so they'd leave their carcasses out there just rotting in the landscape. It's terrible. What's interesting is the federal government dispatched a federal government agent in the 1880s to see if he could find any remaining bison. It was the mid-1880s when this took place. He went in the Southern Plains first, where the Comanche and Kiowa roamed, and couldn't find any. Went up in the Central Plains, couldn't find any there, and then all the way into Montana, he had searched for about 4 years, and then he got to the western part of the Great Plains into Montana right before you get to the Rocky Mountains, and on a rancher's land, he found a small herd of about 50. And the first thing he did is he killed 2 of them, so they could be sent back to the Smithsonian Museum, or what's going to become the Smithsonian Museum in D.C., to be taxidermists, to stuff them, to put on display. Well, the carcasses went missing in the process of taking a train to D.C. It's a crazy story. But what's crazy is the bison herds today are doing much better. There's over 150,000 bison that are in North America. In fact, Ted Turner, the one who owns TBS and TNT and the Atlanta Braves and whatnot, or used to own Atlanta Braves, he actually owns the largest bison ranch in the United States, actually in Montana, but there's bison reintroduced in Oklahoma and Kansas and Nebraska and other places. But anyway, that's why we can now have a bison meat market again, because they are doing much better now as a species. So it shows you right here in this picture what all Native Americans use them for. And so you look at it here at the bottom. In 1865, it was about 15 million bison. By 1885, it was less than 1,000. And so you can see they even used the hoofs. They boiled them to make glue. They used the dung for manure. Skull were used for religious ceremonies. The brains were used preparing the hides, and so forth. Now let's transition to a different animal, cattle. So the first cattle drive actually took place in the American Revolution, where George Washington Army paid the Spanish to drive some cattle from New Orleans, actually, up to his Continental Army. But really, what you have is kind of these early cattle ranches were really part of the Spanish Empire. And then when Mexico gets independence, it's part of Mexico. And then when Texas gets independence, then part of Texas. And then eventually when it gets annexed by the United States. Well, in the early years of the cattle drives, the railroads really hadn't come to Texas. And so what you would do is you would drive these cattle from Texas all the way up to these different cattle towns in eastern Kansas and Nebraska. Now, depending on which town you would take it to, depending on what the price of beef was going for in that area. So if there was better price further north, then you went further north. If it was better price further south, you went south. And so these long drives, which are famous, started in the American Civil, really kind of took off in the American Civil War. They didn't last as long of American history as we oftentimes realize, but they were used to the demand for armies. And eventually railroads are going to be brought to Fort Worth, and then Fort Worth becomes a big cattle town, and other Texas towns as well. But originally it was Abilene, Kansas, Ellsworth, Kansas, Dodge City, and Ogallala, Nebraska were the big cattle towns. Also Cheyenne, Wyoming as well. So this is famous paintings of Frederick Remington. And this one's not Frederick Remington, but these shows you the cow drives. They would brand them so they would know who's the owner of the cattle. And here are 4 of the most famous long drive cattle drives. Goodnight Loving Trail went from central Texas, or part of West Texas, all the way up to Cheyenne, Wyoming. But the Chisholm Trail was probably the most used of the 4. And you see one that went up to Baxter Springs and up into Missouri. The Chisholm Trail, it's kind of interesting. If you've ever been to Texas, Preston Road is one of the most trafficked roads in all the Dallas-Fort Metroplex. But as you get into northern Dallas, the Preston Road is actually where the Chisholm Trail went all the way up into Oklahoma. If you take it all the way up to Frisco and Salina and so forth, that's actually the Chisholm Trail. But it actually went through Fort Worth. It eventually meets in North Dallas area was where it took place. It's just a kind of a natural way the landscape slopes and so forth. And then you can see right here different railroad land, north and south, that was sold. And you can also see mining centers. Okay. You also had a lot of African-American cowboys, because you had about 100,000 exodusters left the South. We covered that at the very end of U.S. History 1 during Reconstruction. But a lot of them get involved in the ranching industry in Texas, Oklahoma, because you could make a decent living, and you were treated pretty fairly on the cattle drives, because you had to be a hardworking man, and you earned your respect. Now, the first cattle that are primarily used for a while is what's called the Longhorn. So, like the University of Texas mascots, the Texas Longhorn. And what ends up happening is British investors wanted to capitalize on the cattle boom in the United States until it eventually went bust in the mid 1880s. So they brought over what's called British cattle. It's a shorthorn cow, and it's fatter and heavier. And so that's what is primarily used today in our beef industry. But the British actually introduced it in American history. There was shorthorn cattle, certainly, but they're the ones that kind of introduced it to really the widespread Western cattle industry. Now, it's actually better for us as people if we actually eat longhorns because they're a leaner cut of beef and it's healthier. It's got less cholesterol. But the shorthorn British cattle is fatter, get higher rates of cholesterol and so forth. But because it's heavier, it gets a higher price per animal. That's why it was sought after. So it's more profitable to be in the British shorthorn cattle industry than it is the longhorns. Okay. Here's some pictures of some cattle drives and so forth on the railroads. Now, what was interesting is that for a while in American history, you could drive cattle and graze across the open range because the open range wasn't settled. But as the Homestead Act progresses and more farmers go out there and goat ranchers and so forth, they began wanting to keep the cattle off of their their grasslands, quit eating their crops or quit eating the grass for their goats. They began putting up fencing. Well, because wood was in such short availability, they developed a guy by the name of Glidden invented barbed wire. It was a cheap way to put up. So you just need a wooden post, and you can put up barbed wire fencing to keep the cattle off of your land. And that, along with the big harsh winter and drought of 1885 and 1886, that killed so many different cattle. It was one of the worst winters ever recorded in the Great Plains. That's really what put an end to the cattle boom. In fact, my favorite president, Teddy Roosevelt, lost like $26,000 in the cattle industry he got involved in the 1880s out in that bubble that burst. This is at outside of a slaughterhouse in Chicago. Here's examples of cowboys. Immigrants were cowboys too, but they always carried a six-shooter, a pistol. Usually the old saying is that Abe Lincoln made all men free, but Samuel Colt made them equal. And so they all carried a pistol for many reasons. Sometimes if you would have a female cow that was giving birth and it had complications during the birth, you didn't want the cow to suffer. You would shoot it in the head to put out its misery if it was going to be sick and dying and so forth. Or you would use it to stop a stampede potentially. You could use it for a variety of things. It's not just the old Hollywood Western shootouts and so forth. And oftentimes in movies, the cow towns are portrayed as the Wild West and dangerous and so forth. Really, the greatest centers of lawlessness were actually mining towns. The mining towns had greater rates of murder, greater rates of prostitution and so forth. The cow towns, yes, they do have some of that, but not near like the mining towns were. The cattle towns were better policed. And so you can see important livestock raising areas. So the Midwest really was the center of the cattle industry, and then Texas, central and southern Texas, and so forth. And then you can see the meatpacking centers were. Gustavus Swift created the meatpacking, really took the meatpacking industry off in Chicago, but really it started off in Cincinnati with pigs, so pork. But eventually they created slaughter centers in Sioux City, South Dakota, and into Omaha, Nebraska. So Omaha became a big cattle town, and then they would ship the beef on refrigerated rail cars to the Eastern factory workers and other people that bought it. Here's Joseph Glidden, who invented the barbed wire. It's crazy. It was a simple invention, but made him a lot of money. All right, we're going to cover life on the Great Plains for farmers in part 2 of this lecture.